This is a fan-generated show. If you would like to support us, please go to jamieglazov.com, and also don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. All your support is greatly appreciated.
Welcome to the Glazov Gang. My name is Stephen Coughlin, and I'd like to take you through my moment and discuss the Countering Violent Extremism narrative, the CVE. It's very important because I think it's something that's underneath the radar screen for most people or imprecisely understood. I actually believe there's a really deep strategic initiative behind it. I also believe that where we are doing countering violent extremism, we are not doing counterterrorism, and it needs to be understood. I know that a lot of people here are familiar with the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the OIC, the second largest intergovernmental organization, second only to the United Nations, and how they have a 10-year program of action to make defamation of Islam a crime in every jurisdiction that is manifesting itself through UN Resolution 1618. What I like to point out is I believe that the CVE, the Countering Violent Extremism narrative, is a support element to it. And I just want to run through a timeline. But before I do, I would like to tell you why I think this is important. This summer, in I think July 2015, Chairman McCall of the House Homeland Security Committee passed a resolution, passed the committee to stand up a CVE office at the Department of Homeland Security. Why do I think this is important? As we'll go through this timeline in a minute, what I will show you is, as it relates to the United States, the CVE was established and set up at the DHS with the assistance of the Muslim Brotherhood. And where we have the Muslim Brotherhood, where we have our operators, whether it's DHS, the FBI, or State Department, engaged in CVE initiatives, they are engaging initiatives that are not American, don't come from the United States, and have in the domestic scene Muslim Brotherhood footprints all over it. So with that, what I'd like to talk about is going all the way back to before the CVE. When I was still in the Pentagon, there was something called TrueSpeak by a man named Jim Gerard. And what he basically advocated was what language we were supposed to use when we talked about Islam. And of course, the language we were supposed to be using was anything you wanted it to be, so long as it didn't have anything to do with Islam. And one day when I queried him, I said, you're promoting this language. Are you aware of it yourself? And he said, oh no, I've never actually looked at these words. I advocate on behalf of the people who want me to push these forward. So it was very clear that he did not understand the language that he was trying to promote. And this was very testy inside the Pentagon. In 2008, Judge Chertoff, who was head of the DHS, Department of Homeland Security, promulgated something called Terminology to Define the Terrorist Recommendations from U.S. Muslims. And in this document that went all through the intelligence community, there was a requirement to start sanitizing the language so that when we discussed Al-Qaeda or the Muslim Brotherhood or the Zarqawi network, which is today ISIS, we were not really supposed to use words like jihad, caliphate, ummah. And the problem with that is, this is the language the enemy uses to define himself. It's the threat vocabulary. If we don't use it, we cannot get our hands around what they're doing. So this became very disturbing because, of course, a lot of people surmised that the recommendations from U.S. Muslims concerned were probably people who were associated with groups like CARE, ISNA, MPAC, Muslim Brotherhood front groups. So now I'd like to bring up the question. I'm going to go back a couple years and we'll re-enter the timeline. In 2004, we had the release of the 9/11 Commission. Do you remember the 9/11 Commission? It was a commission report. It was put out by a Article I commission, meaning called for by Congress, where it looked at the causes of 9/11 and it clearly articulated that it had to do with jihad, Islamic terrorism, and whatnot. Well, MPAC was allowed to testify and say that basically that the language was all wrong and they were making demands that the language from the 9/11 Commission be purged. So now we're back in the year 2008 and we take a look at the FBI's counterterror lexicon, the official lexicon that the FBI was to use in fighting the war on terror. The first thing we found was there was no language of jihad, There was no language of caliphate. There was no language of Ummah. The entire language of the enemy we were fighting, we had major combat activity going on in Afghanistan and Iraq. The entire language of the threat was nowhere to be found in the FBI's counterterror lexicon. More importantly, what I demonstrated was that the definition they used of violent extremism was a definition that so precisely collapsed into incoherence that it was not randomly possible to have it that incoherent, precisely incoherent, like exactly wrong. Soon thereafter, what we found was in 2009, the DIA came out with their unclassified strategic intelligence review, and we looked at its language. Now remember, again, we're engaged in a war on terror against people who unconditionally state they fight jihad according to Islamic law to implement Islamic law. And the unclassified strategic intelligence strategy document never mentioned anything having to do with the language of Islam, except at one point they said Al-Qaeda, and then they had an asterisk and said Al-Qaeda is one example of violent extremist organizations. So I want you to understand, the enemy plans to defeat the United States and the West in the information battle space. What do we mean by that? The information battle space is, of course, propaganda campaigns, subversion. And how do they plan to do that? They plan to do it by controlling the language we use to understand the enemy, and in so doing, keep us from being able to define him properly. You cannot target what you will not define. You cannot talk to something you cannot define. So here we have it. Go back. Now let's move to 2010, and we had the official Fort Hood report that came out from the Department of Defense. It was called Protecting the Force. And you know what was interesting about it? There was no language about Islam in it at all. Now, of course, Major Hassan made it clear that he was acting on behalf of Islam in furtherance of Islam. So it is a fact that that's true. But the official DoD report said nothing. This is where the term workplace violence came, and this is the first overt act where we saw government officials overwrite the known facts on the ground. Major Hassan declaring jihad, saying Allahu Akbar when he's shooting people, in contact with ISIS, with a workplace violence narrative that denied the actual facts. I point this out because it is the goal of violent extremism to overwrite the fact of terrorism with the theory of violent extremism and get people bogged down in academic theories that lead nowhere. So, the interesting thing about it was, I asked the question, how can the Fort Hood report, Protecting the Force, talk about what Major Hassan did without actually talking about why he acted? And the answer is that Fort Hood report never even mentioned Major Hassan. So things started going into high gear in 2011 when the CIA was told to stand down on some terrorism training. And what they did was they stood up. They said they were giving the mission to DHS. In November of 2011, DHS came out with the Combating Violent Extremism, CVE, Training Guidance and Best Practices. And what did they say? One, that Al-Qaeda is the greatest threat America faces, but two, we cannot actually talk about Al-Qaeda's doctrine. It's crazy, isn't it? So the training guidance basically identified an enemy that then created rules that made it impossible for us to be able to define him. Then we go to Benghazi in 2012. Why is this important? Because we now have Freedom of Information documents that demonstrably prove that when Benghazi happened, the reporting made it clear that it was an Al-Qaeda attack at the time. There's no question about this. But we also have those same documents that show that the State Department on the day after Benghazi, on September 12th, spent the entire day coordinating with the Muslim Brotherhood America, ISNA, and the OIC on the YouTube/violent extremism narrative, and that's how they were going to move forward. This is important because that makes it clear that they knew that this was disinformation from the very beginning. In 2014 and 2013, West Point's Counterterrorism Center came out with something called Challenges from the Sideline, Understanding America's Far Right Wing Extremism. This is important because this is where we saw that this violent extremism narrative, which doesn't really apply to Al-Qaeda, keeps coming back to us as applying to people who are conservative. Would you find that disturbing? Because I most certainly would. Because my view is that the violent extremism narrative isn't going to be used to go after the Brotherhood in America for subverting America. It's going to be going after people who believe in the Constitution enough to stand up for it. That makes them extreme. And they would actually go and support and defend it by joining the military. That would make them violent extremists. I want you to think about that. The violent extremism narrative applies to any American who would support and defend the Constitution, as much as it works for identifying Al-Qaeda. So in 2014, the White House czar, Quinton Wachtorowicz, basically said that it is against the First Amendment for Americans in the counterterrorist world to identify Al-Qaeda and ISIS's threat doctrine because it had to do with Islam. And therefore, we started standing up and working with groups in the Middle East to help them, have them explain to us who the nature of the enemy is. And started working with the Sawab Center and the Hidayah Center in the UAE. I just bring this up because this summer I was in Vienna, Austria, at an Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and we were told in an official function that they think that calling the Islamic State should constitute a hate crime. About a month later, we heard Jay Johnson, the head of DHS, say he would no longer refer to ISIS as ISIS, would not call them the Islamic State. And then we heard McCall, the Republican chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, say the same thing. I would like people to start thinking about the CVE, which may be stood up as a permanent office at DHS, because we know that it was the Brotherhood who helped DHS stand it up. We know that the origins of the CVE do not come from American law. We know it comes from abroad. We know it is actually hostile because when you're doing CVE, you are not doing counterterrorism. So as we look to see Republicans institutionalize the CVE entity, I think people need to take time to learn what it is, to understand it, and to oppose it. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. To support this show, please go to jamieglazov.com. Thank you.